this evening's Tegeder talk. My name is Chris Kosowski, a member of the St. Francis Cabrini Church community and part of the parish staff. Many of you will recall that these talks are held to honor the wishes of Father Mike Tegeder, beloved pastor at Cabrini, 2011 to 2016, who, before his death, stated, "If I have any legacy at Cabrini, I hope it is that I encouraged adult conversations about vital topics." The Tegeder Talk series invites speakers to address vital topics of faith and social justice, and most importantly, to encourage conversation. This evening, we hope to have such a conversation. Our topic is Eucharistic eating and the global food crisis. What do we mean by Eucharistic eating? And how is this related to the agricultural, industrial food system that brings food to our tables? Dr. Mary McGann will tell us about the food crisis much of the world is experiencing. Sister Mary McGann will help us see the theological, ecological, and spiritual significance of eating. She will challenge us to see the relationship between the global food crisis and Christian worship. If you've not had a chance to read Sister Mary's book, The Meal That Reconnects, Eucharistic Eating and the Global Food Crisis, you certainly will want to after you hear her speak. Dr. Mary McGann is a faculty member at the Jesuit School of Theology, Santa Clara University. She has several degrees, teaches numerous courses, and has written many articles in addition to several books, plus the book on which she will focus tonight. And for more info about Sister Mary, I encourage you to read the bio that came with your registration of this talk and with your link. Joining Sister Mary McGann will be Father Mike Joncas, a priest of the Archdiocese, an artist in residence and research fellow in Catholic Studies at St. Thomas University. He will moderate our conversation. Before we begin our evening together, let us take a moment of silence to acknowledge that we each stand on indigenous land, whether Dakota, Ojibwe, or of any other tribal nation. Let us pray that we may learn from our past, reconcile the present, and together create a future of justice, equity, and compassion. I am happy to extend a warm welcome to Dr. Mary McGann and Father Mike Joncas. Sister Mary and Father Mike, please begin.
Thanks, Chris. I actually get to begin, even though you get the chance to see the two of us side by side. And in addition to learning about Mary from the links that you have, we thought just before the beginning of the formal talk, it would be a good thing if she were willing to share with our community some interesting facts about her life. I have the great advantage of having graduate school experience with Mary, an extraordinary student, by the way, and have ever since a wonderful opportunity to read her many books and meet with her at various conventions. So, Mary, would you be willing to just share some things that might be of interest to the group?
Surely. But first, let me say I'm delighted to be here this evening. I thank all of those who invited me. And I'll tell you one story about my growing up, which connects me to all of you. So I spent most of my growing years on the East Coast in New Jersey and upstate New York. But my mother was from Minnesota. She was born in Kellogg, and her family had moved east. But when I was about 5 years old, my parents decided to move to Minnesota. And so through the Catholic Rural Life movement, they found a farm. We were not farmers, nor were we farming the farm, but we lived on it. And the farm was owned by Senator Eugene McCarthy. We didn't stay there past 2 years because my dad's work changed, but I have very happy memories of living in Minnesota.
Thanks. We actually have some rather happy memories of Eugene McCarthy too. So
Great.
we move now into the formal part of the talk. And I'm basically just here to pose certain questions and then see how Mary is going to be treating them. So we begin with the question, why is food important to us as human, as spiritual beings?
Well, let me begin by answering that very simply. Food matters. What we eat, with whom we eat, where the food was grown, who goes without, and who decides. These are critical questions in the world in which we live. Eating is about relationships, the foundational relationships of our lives, our ecological relationships with the food-giving earth, with soil and sun and seeds and pollinators, our social relationships with neighbors near and far, some of whom have food in abundance and some who go hungry, our ethical relationships with all God's creatures, their right to well-being, their right to flourishing, and our spiritual relationships with the creator of all, the one who is the source of earth's bounty. These relationships embody our attitudes towards food. Is food a precious gift to be shared with reverence and generosity? Or is it a commodity, a product, a source of profit that humans have a right to control, to waste, to re-engineer? Eating reminds us that we are not self-sufficient and self-sustaining creatures, but dependent on a graced universe. We live in what Norman Wurzbach calls a Paschal economy of creation, in which death and life are closely aligned. We are sustained by the gift of others' lives, given so that we will have more abundant life. Eating depends on the sacrificial giving of other creatures. Eating is likewise a foundational communal act that shapes our life in the world. Eating together is a paradigm of shared life, of human biotic solidarity, of service one to another, of hospitality, making room in ourselves for others' visions of life. Eating from a common table reminds us that life is not a possession to be guarded, but a participation in a mutual giving and receiving, taking only our fair share and recognizing that Earth's plenty is a common good that is meant for all. Eating matters.
For every human being. But I have a further question. It might narrow the focus a little bit, but why then are food and eating important for Christians?
Well, from the very origins of Christianity in the life and ministry of Jesus, eating has been at the heart of how Christians encounter God, of how Jesus proclaimed the reign of God, the good news of God's presence, and how he modeled that reign of God as a place and a time where the hungry are fed, the sick are healed, those who are isolated are included, and the grieving are comforted. Keep in mind that the social context of Jesus' ministry was the Roman occupation of Palestine, where a majority of people were sick and malnourished, where hunger and social exclusion abounded. Warren Carter, in his new commentary on the Gospel of Mark, underscores that in that society, 80% of the people lived at subsistence level or below. 70% were food insecure, and 10 to 15% were enslaved. Meals became the place where Jesus embodied the justice of God, who desires a world of flourishing for all. Jesus' meal fellowship inaugurated a new economy of grace, where all are included, all are nourished, and all are sent out with good news. And from the earliest generations of Christians, meals were at the heart of their worship, their fellowship, their care one for another, lest any had need, and where they knew Jesus present in the breaking of the bread. As one author writes, in the beginning was the meal. And this is our legacy. Eucharistic meal fellowship today is in the context of a major global food crisis, described by some as a global emergency. So many people today are sick and malnourished. Hunger and social exclusion abounds. Eucharistic eating can be a place where communities embody the justice of God, who desires a world of flourishing for all.
Powerful. A double question for you. So what is this food crisis that you are talking about? And maybe even more importantly, how did we get there?
Yes, I'd be happy to answer those questions, but I'd like to use some slides.
Perfect.
So let me just share my screen. So the first thing we need to know about the global food crisis is that it's not a single crisis. I count at least 12 interlocking crises, 5 of which, just a moment, my slide isn't working, so I may need to do this again. So I count at least 12 interlocking crises, 5 of which we'll explore tonight, that together are seriously threatening the future of food and pushing the global community to a tipping point. These food crises are the result of a humanly designed food system that has transformed farming from a cooperation with soil and seeds and sun into a fossil fuel-based, industrialized operation that controls almost the entire process of food production and distribution here in the United States and has a very strong global influence. The origin of this industrial paradigm lies with a small group of businessmen and economists meeting in the 1940s, who saw the possibility of a corporate takeover of the American farm system that would yield excessive profit for those in control. At the time, agriculture was in the hands of thousands of small farmers who had a fair amount of political influence. In contrast, this group of men were not agrarians, not farmers, not agriculturalists, but businessmen in prominent positions. One source of their clout was that among them were 2 future US Secretaries of Agriculture, Ezra Benson and Earl Butz, who served under several US presidents and inscribed the ideals of industrial farming within the food policies of the US government. This new food system that they designed had 4 goals. One, that a small number of corporately owned industrialized farms would control the entire food system, with mechanized labor replacing human labor. Second, that food production would be globalized for the sake of economic efficiency. But notice, not for the sake of the nutrition of the food, or a better cooperation with the earth, but for economic efficiency. Third, processed food would come to dominate the market, and indeed it has. And fourth, a deregulated free market would enable corporations to produce cheap food and still make a profit. The removal of global trade barriers would allow them to obtain crops from countries where prices were lowest, labor cheapest, and environmental regulations and human rights concerns minimal. Today, this system would be judged by some as highly successful. These four goals are accomplished and in spades. But it's precisely this success that leaves us and much of the world in a deep food crisis. In 2013, several organizations within the United Nations declared that industrial agriculture is unsustainable and proposed that it be replaced by a mosaic of regional organic systems. This is a wonderful vision of the future, a mosaic of regional organic systems, and I hope we can return to that later in the evening.
Well, 12 interlocking crises. Obviously, we can't deal with all 12 of them tonight, but I would invite you, if you would, to start with the agricultural crisis, the first of the 5 that we'll be dealing with tonight.
Yes, let us begin with the agricultural crisis, which is critical. Industrial agriculture is an aggressive system that has negatively impacted soil, water, seeds, and biodiversity. Let's look at each of these. Soil is a matrix of life. A handful of healthy soil teems with living organisms. Yet soils are in deep jeopardy today from erosion, contamination, desertification, and salinization due to intensive crop growing, intensive watering, and chemical fertilizers and insecticides, all of which are integral to industrial agriculture. As a result, crop yields have been in serious decline since the 1980s, and several countries around the globe have lost their ability to feed themselves because of soil degradation. Water is the elixir of life, essential to the survival of all living creatures. Yet chemical runoff from agriculture is contaminating streams, rivers, lakes, and creating dead zones in larger bodies of water. The Gulf of Mexico has a dead zone the size of New Jersey. In a dead zone, there can be no life because there is no oxygen. Seeds. If you've ever held a seed in your hand, you've held the key to the future of food. Seeds are carriers of nature's intelligence. A single seed holds the entire food cycle. For centuries, farmers have saved seeds and depended on them for next year's crops. But today, seeds are being altered for profit through hybridization and genetic modification. Local seed varieties are being replaced with industrial seeds, and in many places, using saved seeds has been made illegal, which means that new seeds must be purchased by farmers every year. And from whom do they purchase them? 4 agrochemical companies, including companies like Monsanto Bayer, control 60% of global seed sales. Earth's biodiversity. Evolution has provided us with species beyond imagination that are so essential to life on the planet and essential to our food supply. But industrial agriculture is waging a chemical war on insects, pollinators, and soil bacteria, all of which are essential to food production. And as collateral damage, bird species, fish, and other animals are being poisoned. But there is good news. Change is happening. New initiatives in agroecology, organic farming, and regenerative farming, systems that work with the earth rather than against it, are already reversing these destructive practices. These new modes of farming are a way to the future and need our support.
Could we now turn to the second of the crises, in this case, the humanitarian crisis?
Yes, indeed. Closely aligned with the agricultural crisis is a global humanitarian crisis of hunger, malnutrition, and starvation. The right to food is a basic human right, upheld by international law. Yet 900 billion people worldwide are hungry and malnourished. That's close to 1/7 of the world's population. And another billion have chronic deficiencies of micronutrients that stunts the growth of children. In the United States, 1 child in 6 suffers lack of nutrition and food insecurity. Hunger is a cruel experience. The New York Times carried an article in January about the hunger crisis in Yemen, and the article was titled, "Starving Children Don't Cry." Yet food is cheaper and more available today than any time in history. So what are the causes? Well, certainly food waste. 1/3 of all the food produced worldwide is wasted. But also in the US, 90%, 98% of the corn and 90% of the soybeans grown are not feeding anyone, but are being sold for biofuel and animal feed, which are far more lucrative. In addition, industrial agriculture assumes a myth of scarcity, that Earth's resources are simply inadequate to feed the world's population, and some will always be without food. But this is a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Is there really enough food for everyone?
Indeed, there is. Groups like Oxfam and experts like Vandana Shiva have said over and again, Earth is more than capable of feeding its population, even today with the degradation that's going on. The problem is a broken food system. Francis Moore-Lappé writes that hunger is not a natural disaster, but a social disaster due to human interference in the processes by which Earth provides for its own. However, today, the real game changer with regard to hunger is the pandemic.
Well, what do we know about the impact of the pandemic?
Well, according to the United Nations, acute hunger has significantly increased, especially in countries that were already in food crisis. And in 2019, 55 countries around the globe were identified as in food crisis. Acute hunger means that people's lives are in immediate danger due to lack of food. It's estimated that the food crisis that continues to emerge as we speak is the biggest the world has known in 50 years. The countries of Africa are especially hard hit, but also Venezuela, Afghanistan, Syria, Haiti, and Yemen. The Associated Press reported just this week that over 2 million Yemeni children may face starvation by the end of this year, 2021. In the United States, food insecurity, which before the pandemic had touched 37 million people, is now affecting 54 million, and that includes 18 million children. The impact on children is especially alarming. In addition to COVID's challenges to their education, food insecurity is causing poor health, stunted development, and behavioral issues. But there's always good news. Food banks across the country have been doing a remarkable job. 1 in 4 people coming to food banks today have never used one before. Our own Alameda County Food Bank here, where I live, added 30 distribution sites and signed on with 12 school districts to assist families and children who were food insecure. But where we go from here remains a question.
Well, where we go from here in the talk is to move to the third crisis, the health crisis.
Once again, the World Health Crisis is deeply food related. We all know that food is meant to create health, not disease. Yet chronic diseases that are food related are on the rise. Diabetes and heart disease, obesity and stroke, hypertension, and some cancers. In 2016, there were 93 million obese adults in the United States. One of the primary causes of the breakdown of health is the abundance of processed foods that are full of salt, sugar, fat, and added chemicals. Another is contaminated food, sprayed with chemicals that are known to be carcinogens. It's been said as well that in the United States, the overabundance of cheap food, often processed food, has become a health risk. And we know that the pandemic has not been easy on those with pre-existing health conditions, which have often led to death from COVID. So what's the good news? A growing awareness of the deficiencies of the American diet is leading to a range of new and better food choices. For example, farmers' markets are now the fastest growing part of the US food economy.
Well, then let's turn to the fourth of the 12 crises, the crisis of economic and racial inequality.
Once again, this crisis of economic and racial inequality is deeply aligned with the food crisis. Keep in mind that the industrial food system was not designed primarily to feed people, but to increase the power and wealth of a few corporations and those who own and run them. Corporate control of the food system has led to massive monopolies. 20 corporations now own most of the food production in the United States, and you would recognize their names: Pepsi, Nestle, Kraft, Tyson, ConAgra, General Mills, Cargill, and the litany could go on. 6 companies control 2/3 of the US meat supply. 4 companies control over half the US grocery store sales. Again, Walmart, Kroger, Costco, Target. All of this is driving a deeper wedge between rich and poor. But in addition to wealth disparity, race, gender, and class play a central role in how food corporations make food available. poor communities of color are systematically denied access to healthy food because of price or because of store locations. We've all heard of food deserts, but they might better be called food swamps, because in many, the primary food source is fast food outlets. Ayanna Pressley, the congresswoman from Boston, calls this food apartheid. And then there are farm workers who are at the very bottom of the food supply chain. 90% of United States farm workers are foreign-born. A majority are undocumented residents from rural Mexico. They have no protection under the law, yet they experience exploitation, inhuman working conditions, especially in summer heat, human rights violations, and sexual abuse. 80% of women farm workers in the United States have experienced sexual harassment or sexual abuse, either in the fields or in other places. Yet farm workers remain a hidden part of how food comes to American tables. So what is the good news? Well, food justice movements are making real headway, pointing the way to the future, a food system based in justice for all. In the city of Oakland, California, my neighbor, at least 8 food justice organizations are operative, and these include programs for children and teenagers at risk. Farm workers' unions are also doing very significant work. The Coalition of Immokalee Workers in Florida has developed a fair food program that has harnessed consumer pressure on retail and fast food companies to secure the rights, dignity, and adequate pay for farm workers. This is an amazing movement and is really worth our attention. Justice is at the heart of reforming the food system.
Well, finally, for tonight, let's explore the 5th crisis, the climate crisis, and how it's connected to the food crisis.
Absolutely. This is so critical. The food crisis and the climate crisis are deeply connected. Indeed, the food and climate crises create a two-way crisis. On the one hand, the climate crisis is impacting our ability to feed people, both because of the quantity and the quality of food. In terms of quantity, we've been losing harvests year after year because of excessive temperatures, severe droughts, flooding, and storms caused by climate change. In terms of quality, excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is altering food composition. A study was done in Germany that simulated the atmospheric conditions projected for mid-century, and the grain products that were grown had less protein, less iron, and far more lead. On the other hand, food production is contributing mightily to climate chaos. The entire food system is based in fossil fuels, machinery, fertilizer, transportation. In this system, it takes the equivalent of 400 gallons of oil each year to feed one American, and that's before packaging, refrigeration, or cooking. 40% of greenhouse gas emissions today come from food production and distribution. And food waste contributes 4.4 gigatons of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere annually. But again, there is good news. The Earth's soils have the potential to be one of our best solutions to climate change. Soils need carbon for the health of growing things. Depleted soils do not hold carbon but good soil does. Healthy soils are a carbon sink, like the ocean and the atmosphere. Regenerative farming is putting the carbon back into the soil where it's desperately needed. Healthy soil has a remarkable potential to cool an overheated planet. And on that note, let me stop the slides.
Honestly, I'm overwhelmed. But I know that you will be able to take us from all of this wonderful material and help us to see how these crises touch our own lives.
Yes. Underlying all the crises that I've just enumerated is a spiritual ethical crisis that is impacting the foundational relationships of our lives with the food-bearing earth, with our neighbors near and around the globe, with Earth's creatures, and with the source of all life and health and goodness. This is a crisis that we can and we must address. Wendell Berry, the great agrarian poet, claims that our relationship with the earth and her creatures is either one of consecration or of desecration. He writes, "Just to live, we must daily break the body and pour the blood of creation. When we do this knowingly, lovingly, skillfully, reverently, it's a sacrament. When we do this ignorantly, greedily, clumsily, destructively, it's a desecration. The choices we make about food align us either with the consecration or the desecration of creation."
So what can we do?
Oh, there's lots we can do. Let me point in a few directions that I think are very promising. I think it all begins when we reclaim our role as active participants in the food system, not as passive consumers, but active participants, coming to awareness, getting accurate information, asking who's being served by this system, who is not, and what injustice is taking place. And then we need to make choices, exercising resistance in our purchase of food. It's a powerful way to change the system. Remember, this is a humanly constructed system, and it can be undone by our food choices. Resisting unhealthy processed food, food produced with violence, and there is much violence in our food system. Foods that are convenient but full of chemicals, non-organic food with pesticide residues, food grown at great distances. Few people are aware that the ingredients for the average American meal have traveled 1,500 miles to our tables. And then we need to support new initiatives, small-scale organic farms that are cropping up all over. Two of my friends just started a farm not far from all of you in Hutchinson. It's called Good Cheer Farm. Rebuilding relationships with local farmers and markets that offer local food, supporting CSAs, both because of the organic food that they offer us, but because of their commitment to small farming. Growing food ourselves, and I hope many of you do this, in gardens, in your backyard, on porches, in containers, on windowsills, becoming part of the food system directly, and reaping the joy of watching things mature and become nourishment. David Holgram, one of the founders of the permaculture movement, talks about retrofitting suburbia, filling all the empty spaces with growing things. And then we also need to come to know our food shed, our local food shed, our regional food shed, discovering where and how food is grown in our region, how is it made available, and to whom, and who's not being served. I truly believe that moving into the future is a work of the imagination, asking ourselves, how could things be different? And what role might we play? How might we reimagine the world around us with growing food as part of urban or suburban life? A few initiatives. Community gardens, of course, but then also edible public spaces, social farms and gardens where people work together, grow together, and share the produce. Edible schoolyards. This is one of my favorite initiatives. This was started here in Berkeley by Alice Waters, the chef of Chez Panisse, who found an empty lot next to a middle school and turned it into an edible schoolyard that continues to flourish today. But the concept has traveled the globe, children growing up, raising food, and sharing it. Collective farms, made up of small farms that are regionally grouped, perhaps partnering with indigenous communities in the area. Imagining agriculture as part of civic life, reclaiming civic spaces as commons where food can be grown. Thomas Lyson has a book called Civic Agriculture, Reconnecting Farm, Food, and Community. I highly recommend it. We see this also in a delightful story that Bill McKibben retells in his book, Earth, about the wife of the keeper of coins and medals at the British Museum, who during World War II planted rows of beans and peas and onions and lettuces right at the entrance to the museum. While the whole of Britain during that same war period increased its food production 91% through small gardens and allotments. In all of this, we need to act locally, but with a global consciousness, joining efforts to address and eliminate hunger, connecting with groups who are working for food justice, food security, food sovereignty. And I trust that you know many of these names: Feeding America, Bread for the World, Food for the Poor, The Hunger Project, Save the Children, Oxfam, Food First, and of course, La Via Campesina, the largest grassroots organization in the world, a group of peasant farmers around the globe who are working for food sovereignty. And in all this, we need to return to eating together. The average American today eats half as many meals with family and friends as they might have eaten 50 years ago. The food system has taught us, trained us to eat on the go, to snack, to eat quickly while we're doing other things. But these are sources of unhealth, sources of social isolation. Rather, taking time, preparing meals with healthy produce that's full of color and health and beauty, sharing meals, lingering with conversation, rebuilding relationships, leaving our cell phones behind, and rediscovering that eating together is a sacred act, that meals are a domestic liturgy.
Meals are a domestic liturgy. We've come in some ways full circle. What is all that you have been sharing with us, calling us to do in our Eucharistic eating?
Well, this I hope will be a bit of a bridge to a talk that you're giving, Mike, next week as one of the Tegeder talks. So this is my bridge. I believe that all that we've explored tonight is a call to liturgical renewal. In the midst of a broken food system, can we discover Eucharist as a meal that reconnects? Can we reclaim the foundational meal character of Eucharistic celebration? Remember what I said early in the talk, that the meals of Jesus and the meals of the early communities were central to the origins of Eucharist and central to our legacy. So let me offer 6 touchstones that might help us move in that direction. First, when communities gather for Eucharist, they come as communities of disciples, already intent on justice and right relationships, already engaged in God's mission in the world, locally aware but globally conscious, stretching into a more radical koinonia, a deep concern for the well-being of the global family, recognizing that Eucharist is a meal of God's justice, of God's covenant with all the living. A second touchstone, that all the words that are spoken, sung, chanted, prayed, and preached are truthful, prophetic, and unmask the lies of structural sin. Words that offer a vision of justice making and earth keeping. Words that lament as well as praise. And there's much we need to lament today. Words that speak the same language as Catholic social teaching. A third touchstone, that the community gather around a common table, a simple table at the heart of the gathered community, with access for all. Clearly, this community's table, but open to all the tables of the world, especially the tables of the poor and the hungry. Fourth, that placed on the table, there is a common loaf and a common cup. Not simply hosts, but a loaf and a cup. A loaf prepared by members of the community that can be broken and shared, and a cup from which many can drink, that speak of interconnectedness, one with another, with Christ, and with all of creation, and of the community's willingness to throw in their lot together for the sake of God's mission. Remember what St. Paul wrote, because the loaf is one, we, though many, are one body, because we all partake of that same loaf. Fifth, that the table be a table of abundance, offering an experience and a vision of a world where there's enough for all and to spare. And that all that the community does at the table speaks of God's abundance, God's nourishment, and unmasks the myth of scarcity, the myth of the market, and claims there is enough for all, but we must share. Too often, communities enact Eucharistic scarcity, tiny wafers, perhaps a sip of wine. Rather, genuine eating and drinking befits the Lord's table. And lastly, that everything that's done in word and song and verse and gesture and dance offers thanksgiving for creation, celebrates creation's integrity, honors creation as a revelation of God, as Pope Francis writes in Laudato Si, recognizing that creation and redemption are one mystery, not two, but one mystery of God's love poured out in the world, and that offers a vision of the world in which we are partners with the earth, conspirators, conspirando, breathing together with the earth and sharing earth's proclivity to feed its own, to provide for all. This is our mission. This is our vocation. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you both for this wonderful presentation and conversation. And as I stated at the beginning, the whole premise of the Tegeder talks is conversation. That is what Father Mike Tegeder hoped for. And so now we extend that conversation a little bit broader to all of the listeners and viewers tonight. So now is the time, if you have a question, to add them in the chat. And I will offer to Sister Mary and even to Father Mike, if it pertains to him, the questions that you are offering. So I'll start with just commenting that you gave lots of hopeful news and hopeful examples and some good news amidst the crisis. I loved just your examples of farmers markets and CSAs and small farms and growing food. And you used a term early on, the mosaic of regional organic systems. I loved that phrase. So one of the first questioners said, and you may have answered this in some ways, but I'll offer this person's question. Where is the new regenerative agricultural method being tried successfully?
I think it's being tried in many places, even on very small scale. There are farms, there are gardens that are working in a regenerative way. It's a cooperation with the earth. And as Vandana Shiva points out, that means not only taking from the earth, but returning to the earth, giving back to the earth, whether it's compost or green manure or whatever, to complete the nutrient cycle that needs to happen for good food. Also, there's a lot of work being done right now, and this is in relation to regenerative farming, with planned grazing, putting animals back in the fields and not in CAFOs, bringing the animals into the area where food will be grown, because they enter into that whole process. They fertilize the soil, and that's so desperately needed. Fertilize the soil, eat the grass, and move on. And so the land is being restored. That's a basic part of regenerative agriculture. But I think the concept is extremely important. And any of us who even are gardening, I think, can take it to heart. Do we leave the earth better because we've gardened?
Yeah. I have a tiny thing to add to that. I'm a city boy through and through. And one of the great breakthroughs living on a university campus is when, in addition to trash and recyclables, we now have organics and the ability to take the food that we can't use for our nourishment, but replenish. So a tiny example.
Yes, no, it's a good example. We're all part of the system.
Yeah.
And what we do matters.
Thank you both. Here's the next question. Can you tell us what Vandana Shiva writes about the indigenous origins of regenerative food systems?
Indigenous origins of regenerative food systems. I'm not sure if that's making reference to a particular thing. Vandana Shiva writes on so many things that have to do with food. She certainly talks about local people, small farmers, especially the farmers in India, many of whom have been affected by this industrial agricultural system in a negative kind of way. They've lost their land, whatever. But I believe that it was India where Sir Albert Lord, that's not the right name, a biologist in the 1940s, who went to India and saw how food was being produced and decided they had the answer to how food is grown. So I don't know if that answers the question about Vandana Shiva, but I highly recommend her work.
Good, thank you. Can you discuss how a plant-based diet would affect the agricultural problems you have identified tonight?
Well, in many ways, that happens to be the choice I make about food, is to eat plant-based. It doesn't solve all the problems, but it certainly helps. because plants use much less of the resources that we have. Raising animals, I believe the proportion is that 1 calorie of meat products feeding a human person takes 10 calories of feed in order to produce it. So it's very high on the scale of how the nourishment is used. That's one of the problems with all the soybeans that are grown, which are highly nutrient dense for people. When they're being used to feed cattle, we're losing much of that possibility for nutritious food for people.
I have to confess at this point that I am gradually moving toward much more of a plant-based diet. And I wish I could say it's for some powerful overarching reason. Truth of the matter is, I realized as the pandemic was coming on, I was incredibly obese. And most of it was from eating a meat-based diet. So I have lost, as of today, I've lost 64 pounds.
Whoa,
and that
wonderful.
mostly means that it's been a radical shift to vegetables and fruits, much more than the meat I used to really enjoy. And I suspect I still will on very rare occasions.
Sure, sure. I know from my own health that I feel much better on a plant-based diet.
A questioner asks, does it help at all buying organic food at a major grocery store, or is that still contributing too much to the industrial cycle? This is a question I've heard people wonder, especially
Well,
as stores are now having an organic section.
Well, organic is interesting because a lot of the organic food that's sold in our grocery stores is actually owned by some of these corporations, these food corporations, who know a good market when they see it. And as people are gravitating towards organic food, many of the organic foods are owned by large corporations. The question that we need to ask in a grocery store, which we usually cannot answer, is where was the food grown and by whom? Where was the food grown? How far did it come? That would certainly be one question. But I think it's important if you're buying organic food in the grocery store to try to get more information. I happen to have a magnificent food market that deals only with local growers, local and regional growers. So I can trust, not only do I need to trust the food that they sell me, but they often give you the name of the farm where the food was grown. So Fat Belly Farm, it's a wonderful name, but I know where it's grown and I know that if it's organic, it's organic. Certainly buying at farmers markets will ensure that we have a relationship with the farmers and know where it comes from.
Thank you. This gets close to my own heart. One person writes, in the early years after Vatican II, I recall home masses with loaves of bread and cups of wine. And then another person wrote, do you see the Eucharistic celebration as a meal for the full community? And how does the Dorothy Day's vision fit in? That brings a whole bunch of stuff together.
Oh yeah, for sure. And we did have liturgies. More than one person has said that in my hearing. There was a way we celebrated in small groups after Vatican II that was so nourishing. But in fact, I think we can find that same kind of sense today. We don't have to have a whole meal in order to have a beautiful loaf and a cup of wine. And that can be associated with other eating that the community does. But the whole nature of Eucharist is, in its roots, is that it's a meal. And in eating today, especially in the face of the food crisis, to experience that as connected to the foods that we eat every day. I think we forget that the bread that was used for the earliest communities was not wheat bread, it was barley bread, because people were poor, and that's what poor people ate. It was the same bread that was on their tables. But then over the centuries, it became more and more associated with wheat bread and white bread, which we know today is not very nutritious. White bread and then tiny hosts. I mean, there's been this whole evolution, but it began as being connected to the food that we eat. We pray, give us this day our daily bread, shortly before we enter into that ritual of eating and drinking. So is it our daily food, our daily bread?
Come next week. This is exactly the kind of stuff that I want to be grappling with. So
It's great. Great.
Another member writes, I'm impressed how clearly you wrote about the industrial food system in your book. As a theologian, how were you able to incorporate all this data into your theology?
I think it's profoundly theological. I mean, we're talking about the earth that was created by the one we worship. We're talking about food, which is a basic gift of the earth. I think as theologians today, we need to be interdisciplinary. We need to see the bigger world and see how theology matters. But it's so critical. I mean, there's a whole theology of food. There's several books that are written on that. When we look at Jesus' table fellowship and the work of the early Christian communities, and there are new sources coming out that open that history up to us. And again, Mike is going to be talking about that next week, so stay tuned. But meals are at the heart of where we came from. And so it's really critical.
I'm bouncing around a little bit
That's
back
okay.
in the two topic, or not the joint topic of food and our Eucharistic eating. Back to the first part. Has the industrial agricultural system provided anything positive that can be applied to improve small scale efforts in production?
That's a hard question. I think if you look at it historically, in the first years that it existed, in the first years, there was a flourish of more food. And that was one of the reasons why it was sold worldwide as a green revolution. And for a short time, countries experienced that growth. But today, agroecology and all the new farm methods that are emerging are not based in fossil fuels, for example, but rather in a wedding of traditional agricultural practices and new technologies. But those are not the technologies that are being used by the industrial food system. Perhaps what it's done for all of us is to show us that change is needed. I think we've reached a point where we realize that something else has to happen on all the levels, all the different areas that we talked about tonight, on the level of inequality, on the level of health. All of these things are critical right now and would suggest that we need another system.
I have tried to find tortilla chips that are made locally, one person wrote. So often the package indicates they come from Texas. Is there an easy way to find foods that are produced locally?
Goodness, I don't know. Perhaps there are. I'm not aware of any particular strategy that can be used to find things that are grown locally. It may not be something that really is in our local cuisine. It may be something there will always be exception to the rule of local. Always exceptions. We cannot produce everything in every place. So there needs to be some exchange. But moving towards more local consumption is really extremely valuable, even if it just cuts out the transportation.
Yeah. And Chris, I don't know, but would the earlier Tegeder talk in this series be something that was addressed, how we could determine the local character of the food we're eating? Was Marita dealing with that?
Not, I don't know so specifically as you're asking, but definitely really getting involved in the whole, in the big picture, yes.
Okay.
You mentioned, Sister Mary, you mentioned earlier the advantage of getting to know your growers. And
Mhm.
just take a moment to just plug the co-op, the local co-ops in our Twin Cities. We are in a very rich place as far as
Mhm.
having local co-ops and having a huge abundance of farmers markets,
Mhm.
ways to get to know um, the local um, the local farmer. As Brett Hessla says in one of his songs, I want to place my money in a dirty hand. I love
Mhm.
his farmers market song.
That's great.
Our co-ops often publish in their little magazines stories about the growers too, and
Uh-huh.
find out,
Yeah.
and even opportunities to sometimes visit their farms.
Mhm. And
Um,
some farms will actually invite people to come and volunteer to work along, at least some of the small farms. You know, I mentioned in the book the farm that grows heirloom wheat for Eucharist, Honore Farm. And everyone who's on their mailing list is invited to come for the harvest and be part of it, to cut the wheat, to mill it. It's a wonderful experience, and you feel so connected then to the flour that they produce and the bread that comes from it.
And you asked if there about Marita's talk earlier. One of the efforts she and several other parishioners are involved in at Cabrini is um, obtaining local heritage wheat grains,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
milling them for the community, and
Mm-hmm.
selling for our benefit 5-pound bags of this
Yes,
local heritage wheat
that's
flour.
great. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, One person asks, what kind of hope for change is there given large corporations and factory farms have such power in our government? Where is our hope? You've talked about small efforts, but you want to.
Yeah, but small efforts are cumulative. Someone said a few days ago, in fact, it was Vandana Shiva in a talk that she gave. She said, just remember, it's an interconnected universe. Whatever you do will affect other people and other situations. So I think it's like climate change. We need to believe in the small efforts that we can make. And the more we can connect them with other people's efforts, the better. The more we have a groundswell. So the choices we make about food, the choices we make together about food, the support we give to our food banks, whatever it is, the work with food justice organizations, all of these are making a difference. It's a groundswell. It's coming from below. And so we don't see we're not functioning like the corporations do in a broad sweep, but we're working from little initiatives. But there is hope. I mean, just taking the Immokalee farm workers in Florida, that's an amazing movement that has just grown up from the base. And it's having a big impact. For several years, there was a boycott of Wendy's across the country, and hundreds of people, thousands of people participated because Wendy's would not come on board with their fair food program. And so they used that clout. That's strong. So we need to find the hopeful signs and weave them together in whatever way we can.
Amen.
Thank you. Connecting again to our celebrations of Eucharist. We're fortunate in our parish that people do have a voice in the prayers. There's freedom, especially in the prayers of the faithful.
Mm-hmm.
One person writes, how can we encourage parishes and pastors to include food and agricultural related prayers in the universal prayers? And I guess I would even widen that question to what kind of impact can we have on the prayers of the church? Um,
Well, you're in a fortunate situation, but I think we need to put pressure on our bishops. Has anybody written their local bishop to say we're concerned about this? There are things that need to be brought to our prayer that we never hear about. I think we have to work as we can. Mike, you have something.
Well, I just that I completely agree. And there can be responses to those kinds of questions, those kinds of letters. Put it gently, after the George Floyd murder here, there was a very long time before we, as Roman Catholics of this archdiocese, responded formally to it. But
Wow.
once the offer was made, the Archbishop certainly put his authority behind gathering for that kind of prayer. Now, whether or not that's going to continue as a yearly thing, and how deeply the racial injustice issue becomes part of our public prayer, I don't know. But at least there was a response to it, and I suspect there would be a similar response.
Yeah. The other thing that's related is lamenting, learning to lament, learning to not just have a happy liturgy when everything is beautiful, but to speak about the pain, really speak about it. Certainly we've been pushed in that direction with the pandemic, but to articulate the pain. And lament is a strong tradition in our biblical tradition. Lamenting that eventually leads to praise, but begins with honestly saying, this is what's going on. This is suffering. And we bring this to our prayer.
People are asking good questions and making good comments too, and it's a real challenge to them all and offering the next one. And I know I'm kind of bouncing around a lot.
Okay.
It's conversations do that.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Please make reference to including prayers regarding earth and seasonal rains and the sharing of food.
Yes.
Sunday weekly universal prayers. That, like I said, that's where we have the advantage of being able to speak them aloud at St. Francis Cabrini. And I would hope that in other parishes, for listeners who are listening, that they will find a way to contribute to those.
That's right.
Paired by one person in their parish, that they have a voice there. One right.
If I can interrupt just for a second, it's the joy that we have of being able, Mary and myself, as liturgical historians, and as you, Chris, to be able to go back and see how different cultures grappled with these kinds of questions. Now, most present day Roman Catholics would not even know about rogation days. They wouldn't know that 4 times out of the year we had processions out into the fields, and it's very northern hemisphere kind of thing, but that kind of prayer for the good earth and for the produce of the good earth is something that we could still call on from our heritage.
And the thing I said last about giving thanks for creation, it's amazing how little thanksgiving for creation actually appears in our prayers. It's limited. And yet creation, in a sense, creation enfolds redemption. Creation is the context in which redemption could happen. It's absolutely essential to our piety and our theology and our faith. So prayers in thanksgiving for creation. And Laudato Si is so full of beautiful images. In fact, given the prayers that Pope Francis offers at the end of Laudato Si, you could easily use them as Eucharistic prayers. Just add the words of institution and they would be fine. They're wonderful.
Yes. One questioner even says, haven't the encyclicals over the last 130 years, this writer says, addressed food justice and sustainable farming? If yes, why hasn't the church, especially in America, championed it? Why haven't we taken advantage of the word?
Laudato Si, although it doesn't focus directly on that, certainly gives us lots of basis on which to think about creation.
And I'm suspecting Fratelli Tutti,
yes,
the recent one, is likewise deeply connected, talking about the interconnection of all humans, but all of the created order. And that could be another jumping off point. But those are relatively recent.
They are.
As I read the encyclicals, I hear much more, for example, of Leo the 13th and social justice unions, etc. It's more recent that I think we've been grappling with these questions.
Yes, Catholic social teaching has been more human-centered until recently. But even Rerum Novarum, the very beginning of Catholic social teaching, was focused on human labor. And labor is really critical in the farm systems today. Who is allowed to do the labor? You know, the labor has been replaced with machines. You know, that was a part of the whole system as it was set up. So the dignity and the rights to human labor. Vandana Shiva talks about in India, the farmers who've lost their land and their whole sense of livelihood. They're farmers. They don't want to go into the cities and work, but they can't feed their children. And so they commit suicide. It's a major problem in India, is that farmers are committing suicide because they've lost their land. And so they cannot labor.
This question goes back to, connects to that and goes back to that industrial food system that is affecting us so much. Do you think that we should demand that the public subsidies given to an industry to fuel their operations should be directed to small scale local operations?
Absolutely. If you're talking about farm subsidies, about a third of all the income to large farmers is government subsidy. If that were really redirected towards smaller farms, think of what the change that could be possible. Because often financing smaller farms is the real problem, the real challenge. So, yes, I think it certainly could. Certainly could.
Comment for an ongoing possibility for Cabrini, this person writes, I'd love to have a study group that researches the pluses and minuses of different actions we can take. For example, when is it best to buy local? If I live in a desert, it would require a huge irrigation system to produce local produce.
Yeah, it wouldn't be possible.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be possible.
You know, one of the things our co-ops put forth is not only local, but seasonal.
Yes,
We've gotten
that's another part of it.
We want to have avocados every time of year or whatever.
Blueberries in January.
Mhm.
Blueberries don't grow in January near us, even here in California, where we grow a whole lot of crops. Yeah. So some kind of a variegated system would be necessary. What can we grow locally? What's possible? But too often things are grown that require heavy irrigation that shouldn't be grown in an area. You know, oranges in a desert make no sense because oranges need a lot of irrigation. And industrial farming is based in immense amounts of watering the plants. Irrigation is used excessively. And that's one of the reasons why the soil is salinated.
I'm going to jump slightly in a different direction.
Sure.
And you mentioned seasonal eating. And I really had paid no attention to it until, fortunately, and this is not bragging or anything, but I was allowed to go to Italy and study. And I remember the first time in about late November ordering a caprese salad. And the person that was in charge, mozzarella and tomatoes, the person in charge said, and then in Italian told me, we do not eat these at this time of the year. And partially he was saying, it's because the tomatoes aren't any good and you won't enjoy them and we won't like them. But it was also very clear, we don't do that because it forces an improper kind of distribution of food.
and requires transportation
Right.
because the food has to come from a distance where it can be grown. Yeah.
Yes, one person says, is not eating berries, fruit out of season, a continuation of colonization? Whose
Mhm,
land is being used to produce out of season foods
mhm,
that get shipped to
mhm.
us?
Yeah.
Well, we're drawing near the end of our time. I think what's so beautiful about your book is the way it brings together the global food crisis and Eucharistic eating.
Mhm.
And the last 20 pages were so good. I just wanted to savor a page a day because it was so rich. I'm so taken with your phrase, the mosaic of regional organic systems.
Mhm.
Then I link that to a mosaic of a Eucharistic community.
Mhm.
And I guess I just want to ask a question of how one informs the other, because
Mhm.
I think a rich faith community is a mosaic of
Yes.
and people and
Mhm.
cultures. And um, so I just want to invite you to comment more on that link.
It's a beautiful image, a mosaic, because it has so many colors in it. And actually, it's my understanding that mosaics are put together in such a way that the edge of everything that's part of it catches the light. It's a beautiful image that everybody catches the light in a unique way. So a mosaic, the image of the mosaic farms agricultural systems comes from the United Nations. So as part of their declaring that the current food system is unsustainable and that we need to replace it with this mosaic. But yes, it's a wonderful image for a community and the diversity in the community and the beauty that's reflected in the different colors and the shapes and the way the light is reflected. So yes, please go ahead and use it. Enjoy it. Did you
Thank
want to say something, Michael?
Oh, no, you
No.
have,
Okay.
it's beautiful.
Well, our time is drawing to a close. Do either of you want to make any last comment before I close our evening?
I just want to say thank you to you and the parish community for supporting this kind of conversation, this kind of presentation. I think it's wonderful. I've taken a look at your webpage and I'm actually impressed with the community. I'm just sorry this has not been in person. I would love to meet you, but perhaps another time. But
Yes,
thank you very much.
you're welcome, and we would love for you to come back and celebrate with us. We are able to celebrate in person, and when we are able to have a great loaf on the altar.
That would be beautiful. That would be beautiful. Great.
And I want to just say to all the listeners too that you offered wonderful thoughts and questions, and I was only able to offer a sampling of them here, but they have all been saved, and we will find a way to pass them on to Sister Mary and Father Mike especially, so that they can enjoy the things that we didn't have time to share
Mhm.
here.
Mhm.
Um, to close, I would like to thank you, John Hartman. We don't see him, but I'd like to thank John Hartman for your technical support during
Mhm.
this evening's conversation. And a heartfelt thank you to you, Dr. Mary McGann and Father Mike Joncas. We hope everyone has been inspired to learn more about the global food crisis and how this impacts our attitudes about food we consume and how this relates to our worship and our spiritual practices. Also, we very strongly hope that we will see you next Tuesday for the concluding Tegeder talk in this three-part series with Mike Joncas as he explores Eucharistic living in the light of the recent challenges to worship arising from COVID-19. So we hope we will see you all. There is still a chance to register. Go to the Cabrini website. And good night and blessings to all.
Good night.
Good night.